You're listening to the second part of the fourth module of the International Security course for the online program International Security. In this part of the module, we will look at security in the Cold War, specifically how security strategies changed with the introduction of nuclear weapons into the international system. When talking about security strategies during the Cold War, we have to change our calculus a bit because now with the existence of nuclear weapons, the object isn't necessarily to win a war that's begun, but to prevent a war in the first place. Because, as I think we all know, if a nuclear war begins, especially one that's not limited in any way, it more or less means the end of life on planet Earth. And so the strategy shifts in this context. We're not just trying to win a war, we're trying to prevent one in the first place and still realize our national interest vis-a-vis some other adversary. So how do we manage this conflict that doesn't reach the point where actual shooting begins in this very dangerous environment? And we have three basic approaches here. One, deterrence; two, arms control; and three, disarmament. And we'll look at all three of those in this module. So let's begin with deterrence. We are all familiar probably on some level with the logic of deterrence. It's the idea of trying to prevent some kind of harmful or aggressive act by threatening to respond in usually a greatly disproportionate manner. The idea that if you punish a crime or punish an act in a way that's substantially greater than the damage or the harm of the original act, that you are effectively deterring that act from being made in the first place. There's a logic of this that we see at the domestic level with regards to severe punishments for certain kinds of crimes, the death penalty as a punishment for someone who takes the life of a fellow human being. But it also exists at the international level when states promise or threaten substantial retaliation for any kind of aggressive action. And when we introduce nuclear weapons into the mix, notice that we are greatly escalating the logic of deterrence. We're basically saying any kind of aggressive act against us runs the risk of essentially ending human civilization as we know it, which is, a substantial deterrent. No one wants to end life as we know it. And so when a state with nuclear capability makes this threat, it tends to have a substantial amount of power behind it. To fully understand why nuclear weapons are a game changer with regards to changing the calculus of security, we need to know what they actually do, what makes them so devastating. And here, this is not the greatest chart in the world, but you can see sort of what happens when a nuclear bomb goes off and how the energy is released, the different ways the energy is released. When a nuclear bomb goes off, the first thing that is released is an electromagnetic pulse that will fry all electronic circuitry in the area, meaning that any computers, electronic appliances, anything that runs on electricity is going to be fried. It's not going to work anymore, including computers that might control guidance for missiles and other types of weapon systems. There's also a very bright thermal pulse that goes out that's led by a very bright flash of light that's blinding if you have the misfortune of having it strike your eyes. This is followed by an intense heat wave that will incinerate pretty much anything that's flammable within the explosive area. After this comes the blast wave. This is a wave of kinetic energy that will shatter most buildings. Buildings that are not built with any kind of reinforced concrete or anything that isn't well anchored to the ground will be obliterated. This includes pretty much every house that people live in, most businesses, any kind of structure that's not built in a very significant and reinforced way is more or less going to be flattened by this blast wave. If you somehow manage to survive these effects, you're not out of the woods yet. You are most likely to experience some kind of exposure to radiation. This can take the form of the thermal radiation that's released in the immediate blast that will expose your body to intense radioactive gamma rays that, in the case of those who were exposed to radiation in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, resulted in them having tumors, contracting cancer, leukemia, these sorts of things, and in most cases dying relatively soon after the explosion. If you are further out, you may not get a lethal blast of radiation from the bomb, but the material that's exposed to this radiation during the initial blast will be thrown up into the air by the explosion, and the wind and atmospheric conditions will cause that radiation to move outside of the actual blast area. And a lot of this residue, this dirt and dust and debris from what's been destroyed, is highly radioactive from the exposure. So it will land several hundred miles from where the area was struck and immediately begin to impact and damage through the radioactive exposure any life forms that are in this area where this debris has landed. And depending on the type of nuclear weapon, this debris can be very, very radioactive and cause a great deal of damage to people and to living things, hundreds if not thousands of miles away from the blast zone. Also, this radiation tends to have very long half-lives, which means that the radiation persists for a very long time. This can range from a few hundred years to a few million years in the case of certain nuclear weapons that trigger certain thermonuclear explosions. The radioactive half-life can persist for literally millions of years, which makes the place uninhabitable for a very, very long time. Most of the time, nuclear weapons are measured by their kinetic blast capability, and this is measured in kilotons, where 1 kiloton is equal to 1,000 tons of traditional dynamite, traditional TNT. To give you a sense of what this looks like, if you think about the Hiroshima bomb, the very first nuclear bomb that was dropped in anger, so to speak, that bomb was 4 kilotons, meaning that it had the blast equivalent of 4,000 tons of TNT. And that's a very destructive bomb, as we know. If you look at the pictures of Hiroshima after the nuclear bomb was dropped, much of the city is leveled, it's destroyed. But actually, this turns out to be a relatively small bomb when you compare it to the types of weapons that exist today. For example, an American Minuteman III, a ballistic missile, one could argue it's the most common form of ballistic missile in the US arsenal, can have up to 3 to 4 megatons of nuclear blast capability. And a megaton obviously is a 1,000 kilotons, so we're talking about something the equivalent of 1,000,000 tons of TNT, and that's quite substantial. And in a moment I'll tell you how you can actually boost the number of megatons a single missile can produce. And it turns out that we can actually go more destructive. If we're talking about hydrobombs or thermonuclear explosions, and I'm not going to go into the details of what makes a nuclear bomb different than a hydrogen bomb, but suffice to say, hydrogen bombs are substantially more devastating. We can have an explosion that has the damaging effects of 10 megatons, or literally 10 million tons of TNT, which again will destroy pretty much anything that is hit by this type of weapon. So nuclear weapons, as you can see, are very, very powerful. But they're also somewhat difficult to produce, as we're seeing right now with sort of the tensions with North Korea. North Korea, we know, has the ability to produce nuclear weapons and may have the ability to produce thermonuclear weapons. The challenge for them right now is getting the missiles to go where they actually want them to go. That turns out to actually be a more challenging task than actually developing the nuclear technology. However, we do see that most states do not have a nuclear capability. That's largely by choice. But also, when we think about terrorists and why terrorists don't have nuclear weapons, the technology is advanced enough and expensive enough that it's not easy to necessarily acquire. However, when you do acquire it, it's pretty easy to produce substantial arsenals. And again, I think we're seeing that with North Korea right now. They have the technology, they have the ability to produce nuclear weapons. And so now we see them starting to build up an arsenal, which from the American point of view and the South Korean point of view is a very dire development. So how do we deter states that have developed a nuclear capability and are building up their arsenals? How do you deter that state from attacking you or an ally or acting in an aggressive manner? In the Cold War, this problem was quote unquote solved by the logic of man, mutually assured destruction. This is probably something you've heard before in some context. Mutually assured destruction is the idea that any nuclear attack will be met with such massive retaliation that both belligerents will be destroyed. It's essentially saying, if you attack me with nuclear weapons, yeah, you're going to destroy me, but I will have enough of a counterstroke available. There'll be enough time for me to launch my arsenal back at you in order to destroy you as much as you're destroying me. And so there is a sense that once you make this very dire and profound threat, you are effectively deterring your adversary from acting in an aggressive way. And we see that deterrence works most effectively not just when it's thought of in a defensive capacity, but also in an offensive capacity, in trying to develop ways to use nuclear weapons offensively. You are, strangely enough, actually making the system more secure. There are basically two problems we confront when we try to use mutually assured destruction as a deterrence approach. One has to do with credibility, the other with stability. The credibility problem basically stems from the idea that even though we can threat to blow up all living life on planet Earth as a way of deterring someone from acting aggressively, to deter someone from attacking us with nuclear weapons, that's a pretty profound threat. And there's a temptation to think that your adversary is not actually going to go through with it, that no one is prepared to destroy everything, every living thing on Earth, simply to preserve themselves. Especially if there's an aggressive attack that one cannot necessarily retaliate effectively against. And so how do you make your adversary actually believe you mean what you say when you say you're going to destroy them and everything else if you're attacked aggressively? And the Cold War gives us some examples, at least from the American side, where they did come across as credible, that the Soviet Union backed down or at least held serve when they began to act somewhat aggressively. The first is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there was a threat, again, of massive retaliation, not just for an aggressive Soviet attack against the United States, but the placement of nuclear missiles in Cuba, right? The Soviets didn't say we're necessarily going to attack you by putting missiles in Cuba. They were simply saying we're putting missiles in Cuba as sort of a way of making it easier for our missiles to attack you. And for the United States, that was unacceptable. The idea that missiles fired from Cuba would only have 10 minutes flight time, as opposed to the normal 30 minutes flight time for a missile launch from the Soviet homeland, was enough of a threat to American security that Kennedy and his administration decided that we are in fact going to risk nuclear war, not because you attacked us aggressively, but because it was easier for you to attack us aggressively. And that's essentially what the Cuban Missile Crisis was all about. In the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and to a certain extent even before, you have a similar way of dealing with this issue with what's called flexible response. That basically says we don't have to use nuclear weapons every time you act aggressively. For example, think of the Korean War when the North Korea invaded South Korea. That was not met with a nuclear counterstroke, even though theoretically that might have worked because at the time the Soviet nuclear program was still very, very new and it wasn't clear how effective it was. Same thing with Vietnam, that though there's what appears to be an aggressive act by a regime that is supported by both materially and symbolically by the Soviet Union, there isn't necessarily a move to use nuclear weapons to stop this. This sense is that a conventional counterstroke is appropriate here. Of course, what all these examples show is that there's an escalation problem. That's something that can begin as rather harmless and of a fairly petty nature can quickly ramp up to the possibility of a nuclear exchange. And so that leads us to the next problem of stability. In order to be credible, you have to show signs that you're actually willing to follow through with your threats. But how does you avoid not having the situation devolve out of control? So this brings us to the stability problem, and in order to maintain the stability of mutually assured destruction, both actors, and again I'm assuming by bipolarity here, both actors' capabilities have to be relatively similar. There can't be a great advantage in the nuclear arsenal of one state over the nuclear arsenal of another state. And that was a challenge during the Cold War, especially given that the American advantage was quite profound for the first 10 or so years after the World War II ended. But the United States enjoyed a substantial advantage both in numbers and in effectiveness of their nuclear weapons. It took a while for the Soviet Union to catch up. When they did catch up, they caught up and then in many ways surpassed the American capability, which caused a great deal of consternation among defense intellectuals in the United States, believing that there were things called missile gaps, namely the notion that the Soviet Union has so many more missiles than us that there'll be a temptation to act aggressively and that the deterrence capability of the American nuclear arsenal is no longer sufficient. And it wasn't just numbers, it was also platforms and the ways that you positioned and placed nuclear weapons. We see this a little bit already with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the idea that if you put missiles in Cuba, you reduce the flight times, therefore it's easier to launch a surprise attack. But it turns out there are other ways, in many ways more effective ways, to shorten those flight times and create the possibility of a preemptive surprise attack that will actually be effective. So let's look at trying to maintain the stability in terms of numbers of nuclear arms. As I already alluded to, the United States has a rather significant advantage at the beginning of the post-World War II era that they maintained for about a decade or so. But once we get in the 1960s, the Soviet Union sort of really begins to catch up and begins to construct an arsenal that quickly equals and then surpasses the capability of the United States. Notice that by the end of the 1980s, we're talking about a combined nuclear arsenal, both the US and the Soviet Union, of approximately 70,000 nuclear warheads. And remember, it only takes a few hundred extremely powerful thermonuclear explosions to more or less destroy life on planet Earth. And here we're talking about an arsenal that has significantly more than what's necessary to accomplish that task. And again, it may seem a bit absurd. Why do we need this many nuclear weapons to have effective deterrence? But again, the idea is that if your adversary has, quantitatively speaking, a superior number of weapons than you do, then that will create the temptation for them to act aggressively, especially if they think they can knock out and destroy your nuclear capability before you have a chance to use it in retaliation. So that's why there was this real focus on trying to keep the numbers relatively balanced. you'll notice that the US doesn't really increase its nuclear arsenal after the 1970s. And part of that is because American nuclear capability, especially the nuclear rockets, were more accurate than the Soviet ones. And it was believed that um, the American rockets would actually hit what they're aimed at, where the Soviet accuracy was a little bit more dubious. And it actually turns out with nuclear weapons, you actually want to try to be as close to your target as possible. So we have lots of nuclear weapons, but it turns out not all nuclear weapons are made the same. And then again, this goes to trying to create stability and balance between the Soviet Union and the United States. The most common form of nuclear weapon, the most common form of deploying a nuclear warhead is the land-based ballistic missile. These are housed in bunkers underground. When it comes time to fire them, a hatch opens, and the missile more or less flies out of the silo that it's housed in. These missiles are basically rockets, not unlike rockets that you would use to launch satellites into space. They have a long booster that causes them to achieve a low Earth orbit. And then the top of the weapon, the nose cone, inside of which there may be anywhere between 1 and a dozen nuclear warheads, will essentially go into orbit, a low orbit, position itself over the target area, and the vehicle will release the warhead, and the warhead will fall back to Earth, impacting the target it was dropped on. These missiles are very dangerous and destructive. They have the destructive equivalent of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. However, from a strategic point of view, they have one liability. They are static. They cannot move in terms of where you put them, which means that, again, if your adversary knows where they're located and can somehow launch a sneak attack, they can be taken out without you having a chance to use them in retaliation. So to solve this problem of immobility, you put some of your nuclear capability on bombers, which can obviously take off and attack directly targets in your adversary's territory. For much of the Cold War, bombers were in the air constantly. Nuclear bombers with nuclear weapons on board were flying in sort of circular patterns 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, on holidays and whatnot, basically waiting for the order to fly to the Soviet Union and attack whatever targets that they have been assigned. Notice that the reason why you have these bombers flying in the air constantly is so that they don't get caught on the ground by a sneak attack. Even if you do have a successful sneak attack that takes out your ballistic missiles, you have these bombers that are already in the air that can fly over and immediately launch a counterstrike. Bombs dropped from aircraft also tend to be a bit more accurate, and as a result, if you're trying to hit some kind of especially difficult or protected target, you can use a bomber to hit it with a little bit more precision. And these were very important platforms, especially in the early days of the Cold War. I have a picture here of a B-2 stealth bomber. Notice why it's a stealth bomber. You don't want to have it be picked up by radar and shot down. But if you go back to the 1950s and the iconic B-52, these were bombers designed primarily to drop nuclear bombs on the Soviet Union. But perhaps the most important nuclear platform in the Cold War was the nuclear-powered submarine, the nuclear ballistic missile submarine. As you can see for the photo here, you can put anywhere up to, a dozen, 2 dozen missiles, depending on how big your submarine is, on one of these platforms. And the nice thing about submarines is that they go underwater, they can't be seen, they can't be easily detected, and can maneuver off the coast of an enemy state, pop up, launch their missiles, and basically destroy a city with only a few minutes notice. So these are very powerful weapons, they're very dangerous weapons. And the only way to deter them is to have a submarine missile capability yourself in order to, again, deter any kind of aggressive action. The submarines also tend to be nuclear. In fact, they almost have to be nuclear submarines. And by nuclear, I mean nuclear powered. Nuclear powered submarines have the advantage of being able to submerge deep underwater and stay there without having to come up for a very long time. The old submarines that you've seen in World War II movies don't dive very deep, and they can't stay underwater for very long. They're powered by diesel engines. Diesel engines make a lot of noise. They put out a lot of exhaust. That exhaust has to be um, put out into the air. You can't put out that exhaust underwater. So you need to be up near the surface where you can stick your snorkel up and evacuate that exhaust. You can shut off your diesel engine and run on batteries, but notice that batteries don't last forever. They obviously only give you a limited amount of time to operate on. Where you solve all these problems with a nuclear-powered submarine, which doesn't have to worry about batteries and snorkels and diesel engines and whatnot. Thus, you create what's called a second strike capability, that even if the worst thing happens, your adversary launches a sneak attack, destroys all your bombers, destroys all your ballistic missiles, you still, somewhere out in the oceans of the world, have this fleet of ballistic missile submarines that can pop up, launch a second strike, and obliterate your enemy. And to sort of drive this point home here, I like to show the picture here of a weapon that the Soviets, a platform the Soviets had, the Mobile Land Missile. If you think about how vast the Soviet Union is, especially Siberia, it would make sense that the Russians would, or the Soviets, I should say, would use that vastness of the wilderness to their advantage. And so they would take some missiles and put them on these giant trucks, and they would basically drive these trucks around the wilderness on the belief that if the Americans ever launched a preemptive attack, they wouldn't be able to destroy all these trucks wandering around the woods of Siberia. It's the same basic idea as the submarine, only here we're talking about a land-based platform rather than a sea-based platform. As I alluded to earlier, modern ballistic missiles have the ability to carry an additional amount of megatonnage. And this is largely due to the technological advancement called the MIRV, the Multiple Independently Targeted Reentry Vehicle. And this basically allows a warhead, more than one warhead, to be placed onto a nuclear missile. Here the picture shows 3 nuclear warheads in a MIRV package here, but you could theoretically put as many as a dozen onto a very large nuclear missile. And notice that with a single booster, you can deploy and deliver a dozen thermonuclear blasts with just one missile. So you can see why these technologies are very, very devastating because you are greatly enhancing the ability to sow more destruction with less capability. These are very difficult to produce. Only the Soviets and the Americans have produced this kind of technology, although we believe the Chinese have a simple, crude MIRV capability. This is not something the North Koreans have and are probably several decades away from developing it. Though they may be trying right now, we don't know. What we see here is sort of the way the Cold War belligerents try to create stability in a nuclear world. They developed what was called the nuclear triad, where you take your nuclear capability and you place it on these 3 primary platforms, missiles, bombers, and submarines. And that way there is no possibility that any aggressive or preemptive or surprise attack can ever be successful. That again, even if your adversary is successfully knocks out your land and air-based assets, you have those hidden sea-based assets slowly creeping at the bottom of the ocean and can come up to the surface and launch the second strike or the counter strike against your adversary. And this was, again, how stability was created, basically ensuring that, again, mutually assured destruction. Everyone would die in a nuclear war. However, there is a certain absurdity when we look at mutually assured destruction, especially during the more heady days of the Cold War when you've got almost 100,000 nuclear devices in the world. And there's a sense that at some point you're increasing the risk of conflict and war by having so many devices and so many weapons in circulation. So there is an effort recognized by both sides, especially after the near miss of the Cuban Missile Crisis, of trying to ramp this logic down a bit. We're not going to give up our nuclear arsenals, but we're going to maybe take efforts to limit and cap the numbers of weapons that exist in the world right now. And notice that arms control is a cooperative effort. It is not necessarily one state acting unilaterally, deciding on their own that they are going to cap or reduce their nuclear weapons, that both sides agree to cooperate on this as a matter of policy, that both the Soviet Union and the United States agree that there are too many nuclear arms in the world, and that we're going to cooperate to try to limit them. So we see cooperation between the USSR and the United States in the Cold War because both sides recognize that they have an effective deterrence capability, and there's no more need to build and deploy more nuclear capability. Arms control isn't just about superpowers, but it also extends to non-nuclear states, and the idea that a state that has the ability to produce nuclear arms may in fact choose not to because they, for whatever reason, determine it's not in their interest. And we can make a distinction between these two types of arms control by identifying the difference between vertical proliferation versus horizontal proliferation. Where vertical proliferation is what we see in the Cold War, it's the attempt to limit the total number of nuclear arms in the world held by two belligerents, two bipolar states. Whereas horizontal proliferation is the attempt to limit the spread of arms to more than two states or beyond the states that already have them. The numbers may not be all that high, but the number of states that have nuclear weapons increases. So it's a question of kind of quantity versus quality. Quantity in the vertical sense, trying to limit the total number of arms in the world, and in the quality sense, in trying to limit the number of states that have arms in the world. And here we just reiterate what I've said with the difference between vertical proliferation and horizontal proliferation. Notice that in the Cold War, we see the emergence of a club of nuclear weapons holders or weapons of mass destruction holders. And the vertical proliferation logic is that these people get to keep their capability, but that they will not build any more. Whereas in the horizontal proliferation, we see an expansion in the number of states that join the club. And with certain measures like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the attempt is to not expand the club, as it were, not expand the numbers of states that join the nuclear capability club. There are many good reasons to pursue arms control, and a lot of them have nothing to do with pursuing arms control because war is quote unquote evil or wrong or some other kind of argument you'd hear from people opposed to war as a principle. There's a lot of good strategic reasons to pursue arms control. One of them is because military capability is very dangerous when you lose control of it, when weapon systems are developed that you no longer have the ability to control. This is one of the problems with nuclear proliferation today, is that the technology has proliferated to a point where we're very much concerned that non-state actors, specifically terrorists, have the ability to use or get access to nuclear technology and use it for some very nefarious ends. And so you pursue arms control as a way of trying to limit the proliferation of that technology and keep it under the control of what one hopes are rational state actors. Secondly, developing advanced weapon systems in both quality and quantitative terms is very expensive. And oftentimes, it's not a good investment to direct resources towards these expensive platforms. And if you can make deals with your rivals or adversaries to not pursue these weapon systems, that frees up these funds for other outlays. And again, someone as noble as Dwight Eisenhower made this argument when he said that every time we, being the United States, build a bomber, a missile, a military equipment, that we are essentially robbing a child of education, healthcare, and some kind of future. Thirdly, arms control is a good way of trying to buy time if you are a weak state wanting to catch up militarily with other states. It's easy to go into an arms control agreement for a weapon or a platform that you don't yet have the capability to produce. And so it may be very cynical, but also very useful to enter into an arms control agreement that limits the development of a particular weapon that you don't have, but that your enemy might have or might have the ability to develop, so that you can gain yourself the time to catch up, to develop that weapon system, to develop that technology, and then go ahead and, abandon arms control at a later point in time. So let's take a look now at how the United States and the Soviet Union implemented arms control regimes as a way of limiting, capping, and eventually reducing the number of nuclear weapons in the world in the latter half of the Cold War. To do this, we need to know what a regime is, because there's some confusion that often comes up when you talk about these things. We don't mean regime as a way of talking about government, because oftentimes you hear the term regime change, which means we're changing or toppling the government of a particular state. Here, what we mean by regime is a series of treaties that, when bundled together, create a framework for interaction. So, for example, what we're about to look at here is the nuclear arms control regime. It's not an actual government. It's a set of treaties that sort of, when put together, creates a set of rules and norms and expectations that both the Soviet Union and the United States were expected to follow. And there were some rudimentary ways of trying to verify that both states were honoring their obligations. Regimes tend to change over time. New treaties are added to them, which changes sometimes their focus and their objective. We'll see that here, where the nuclear arms control regime begins as an arms limitation regime, then becomes an arms reduction regime. And sometimes we'll see regimes actually transform into formal organizations. When the regime becomes so complicated, it requires an actual body to manage it. That doesn't happen here, but it does happen in some other cases. So we can take a look now at the arms control regime that emerged during the Cold War, and you'll see that these treaties all kind of fall into their own categories. In this case, we have the nuclear test ban regime, which is comprised of 4 treaties that in some way, shape, or form banned the ability of superpower states to test nuclear weapons. Turns out that in order to make sure your nuclear weapons work, sometimes you have to test some of them, especially as they get older and you want to make sure that they still work correctly. So the test ban regime basically outlaws the following activities. The first ban is the treaty banning nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater, because these tests are the most devastating to the environment in terms of atmosphere and underwater testing. And with the case of space, the fear was that if superpowers began blowing up nuclear missiles in space, that would quickly turn into developing a space-based weapons delivery capability, that you would put satellites in space with nuclear weapons on them that would be orbiting your enemy, and it could be dropped on them at a moment's notice. So to sort of prevent both sides from gaining that capability, they banned nuclear tests in outer space. In 1974, they took another step by saying you can only test nuclear weapons underground. In 1976, they acknowledged that nuclear weapons can be used for non-military purposes. If you're trying to, for example, get at some minerals that are deep underground, sometimes setting off a nuclear bomb might be the best way of clearing out some of the rock that's blocking access to those minerals. And finally, in 1996, there was the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was basically going to ban all nuclear testing. Bill Clinton was the president at the time. He was one of the chief negotiators of this treaty, but when George W. Bush became president, he said this is not in our interest, and he did not sign the treaty. So to this day, the United States has not signed the Test Ban Treaty. We can then move on to arguably some of the most important treaties of the Cold War. These are the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, usually given the acronym SALT. These are treaties designed to limit the number of strategic arms in the world that can be possessed by the two superpowers. Most of these treaties come about as a result of negotiations between the old Soviet Union, but have persisted even when the Soviet Union becomes the Russian Federation. And there are quite a few treaties here, and it's going to get a little tedious, but I think it's worth mentioning them. So the first installment of Strategic Arms Limitations Treaties is given the moniker SALT I. This first treaty comes as a result of negotiations between Carter and Brezhnev in 1972. The SALT I treaties end expansion of land-based nuclear missiles. They limit, but do not end, the expansion of non-land-based nuclear missiles, so missiles that are primarily deployed on submarines. And perhaps most importantly, it allowed the superpowers to inspect each other's facilities to ensure that the state was complying with the stipulations of these treaties. In 1979, there was another round of SALT treaties. These sought to limit all forms of offensive nuclear capability, both in terms of numbers and in terms of their power, in terms of their qualitative capability, how much megatonnage that they were allowed to carry. This was an agreement in principle. It did not result in any reduction of stockpiles, and it did not have any mutual inspection allowances either. In 1987, you have another very important treaty, the INF Treaty, which stands for the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty. This was a treaty that was signed by Reagan and Gorbachev that eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. As the name suggests, this class was the intermediate range nuclear missile. If we make a distinction between long-range strategic missiles that fly over the pole and travel halfway around the world, and short-range missiles used in battlefield situations, you have an intermediate classification for missiles that would be launched, for example, from Western Europe to Western Russia, Western Soviet Union, Eastern Europe. These missiles were basically eliminated as a result of the INF Treaty. And this is important because it eliminated strategic nuclear arms from Western Europe. After 1987, there were no more ballistic missiles of any kind in Europe. And this has been a source of tension in European society when the United States had nuclear missiles in places like Germany. Many of the Germans didn't want those nuclear missiles there. And so the Americans removing them was important for making sure there was good relationship with a key ally, and also reducing the possibility of these missiles, these weapons being used in a wartime situation. As the Cold War ends, you see the strategic arms regime shift from limitation to reduction. And the first set of treaties to do this are the START I treaties from 1991. These treaties reduce the number of nuclear warheads to 6,000 for both sides. They allow for inspection and observation, and then are quickly followed up a few years later by the START II treaty, which basically reduces stockpiles by another 2,500, so that the total number of nuclear weapons permitted by both sides is 3,500. For many, however, reducing nuclear weapons and reducing military capability isn't enough, that the ultimate goal should be disarmament. If states don't have weapons, then they can't go to war. And obviously this looks a bit pie in the sky, but this has been a fairly prominent part of security studies for a very long time, and so it's worth spending some time taking a brief look at it. Even if disarmament is a pie in the sky objective, having it as a goal can sometimes be useful, especially when we're talking about arms control. Yes, we're not ever going to fully eliminate nuclear weapons, but we should, in our negotiations, act as if that's sort of a goal in the abstract. Secondly, even there are cases where disarmament is a practical matter, is something that can actually be realized. Maybe not in total terms of eliminating weapons completely, but there are classes of weapons that we have effectively created disarmament regimes and disarmament treaties around. And so it's worth taking a look at what they are and why those disarmament protocols exist. So remember, we're talking about treaties that eliminate weapons, that not merely reduce them, but actually eliminate them with regards to disarmament treaties. And it turns out when we're talking about weapons of mass destruction, and we're leaving nuclear weapons out of this category because, as we've seen, the arms control treaties mostly deal with them. We do see treaties that attempt to create a situation where these weapons are banned, that the states are basically disarming themselves of this capability. The most prominent example of this is the Biological Weapons Convention from 1970 through. Notice that this treaty is quite powerful in that it doesn't only ban the possession of bioweapons. And here we're talking about weapons that use strains of diseases, of viruses, to essentially destroy and degrade the society and military capability of an adversary. Examples include things like anthrax and weaponized botulism and this sort of thing. The Biological Weapons Convention not only bans the use of bioweapons, but also outlaws their research and development. In other words, we're not even going to let you develop the capability of deploying these weapons, much less deploy them formally. Because of this, the U.S. has not signed this treaty. They argue that while they themselves have no aspirations of deploying bioweapons, other states might, other states have. And so we need to research them in order to develop antidotes. So for this reason, the U.S. has said they're not going to sign it. And so finally, we can take a look at the Chemical Weapons Convention. This is a treaty aimed at eliminating chemical weapons from the arsenals of the world. This treaty bans all chemical agents, forbids their use in any kind of combat or warfare situation. It's directed primarily at things like mustard gas and sarin and some of these other really nasty compounds that can be very lethal when exposed to human bodies. There is an exception for tear gas, of course, because tear gas is something that is used in a non-combat situation. And so there's an allowance or an exception made for tear gas. The Chemical Weapons Convention does allow for inspection, actually creates its own institution, its own organization to enforce the protocols of the treaty, the OPCW, Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. So this is an example of a regime that is sufficiently complex that it becomes an actual organization.